2 weeks, Mark Tom was, not Mark Tom, John Mark. Mark Tom Hicks is the guy that baptized me when I was 13 in Alabama. I always get those two guys mixed up. John Mark Hicks, who is young enough to be Mark Tom Hicks' son easily, was here last week and taught in the Sunday morning class. So we are up to chapter 9 in 1 Kings. Solomon has finished his temple for God. He has finished his palace, and the palace for his wife, one of the princesses of Egypt. He has dedicated the temple, and he prayed a very long prayer in chapter 8, as you recall. And then at the end of that prayer, he threw the largest 2-week tailgate barbecue that has ever been thrown in the history of humanity. And we discussed that at some length, how that was actually less, involved in destroying sacrifices and more involved in eating than anything else. They called it the fellowship offering. When we traditionally think of an animal sacrifice that the Jews made, we assume they burned the entire animal up, but that was generally not the case. Generally, the edible meat was saved, and part of that went to the priest, and then the rest of it went back to the person who either presented the sacrifice or they shared it with others. Again, I mentioned right at the end of class 2 weeks ago, I think, that if you want to be scriptural, one of the most scriptural things that Christians ever did was eat together. In fact, you hear about Jesus doing this all the time. He's always eating with somebody. And the early Christians were always eating together. In fact, we read Acts 2:42, and it said every day they met from house to house, eating together. And joining in fellowship and the apostles' teaching and things like that. And this subject comes up numerous times. So those who think that Christians eating together is not a scriptural activity that's inappropriate for a church building don't know their scriptures. Eating together is the single most scriptural thing that Christians do together. It is mentioned more often than any of the other joint activities that we do together. So, that ended after 2 weeks. Everybody comes off of the huge church retreat high and goes home back to everyday business. And in chapter 9, it says, God appears to Solomon a second time. Previously, before he dedicated the temple, actually before he built the temple, God appeared to Solomon and made the famous offer of granting any wish that Solomon wanted. And Solomon chose wisdom over riches and long life and victory over his enemies and things like that. And God gave him those things too, because he was smart enough to ask for more smarts. So in chapter 9, Solomon finishes all of that work, and it says, Jehovah appeared to him a second time as he had appeared to him at Gibeon, meaning he appeared to him in a vision-like dream, which is how it was described in the first case. God mentions that he had heard this long prayer and the pleas that Solomon had made. He asked God on numerous occasions during that prayer for, when we do this bad and we repent, hear our prayer and restore us or forgive us. He says, I've heard the prayer and the plea you've made before me. I've consecrated this temple which you've built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. And then he puts a charge in front of Solomon. In verse 4 he says, as for you, by the way, he's speaking only to Solomon right here, and the word is singular in Hebrew. He says, as for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. Now, he switches gears here in verse 6, and the you becomes a plural you in Hebrew, oddly enough, because it still sounds like he's talking to Solomon, but apparently he has broadened this a great deal. He says, but if you, like y'all in Southern English, but if y'all or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given y'all and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble, and all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has Jehovah done such a thing to this land and to this people? People will answer, because they've forsaken Jehovah their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord, or Jehovah, brought all this disaster on them, and this comes to pass. In fact, my eyes stuck on the Israel will become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. I cannot think of a race of people who have been ridiculed and maligned and had more jokes made about than the Jewish people. They have truly received the brunt of our hatred and I can't think of the word. People you make jokes about. Stereotypes of Jews are just abound in our culture and in our history, in our literature. You remember Shylock? Which of Shakespeare's plays is he in? Can't remember. Anyway, he was a money lender or changer or something, Shylock, and so Shylock comes into the language as a word that we use for that sort of thing. They were hated by the Germans in World War II, and that was not new. They were blamed for things they had absolutely nothing to do with. And so these words, you will become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples, ring extremely loudly in my ears. No one has been as much an object of ridicule and hatred as the Jews, and it's very sad. But he said it would happen, and it did. And the temple 500 years later was completely destroyed when they were carried off into captivity, and it was not built until approximately the time of Christ, somewhat before his birth, but in that time frame by, I believe, Herod rebuilt it. Okay, so he says, if you're going to follow my rules, things will go well with you. If you don't, things will go badly with you. Now, that was very Jewish thinking, was if you do right things, God will reward you here and now, and if you do wrong things, God will punish you here and now. That was all religions, yes, that is correct. In fact, in some religions, the Roman religions, you would just get punished because the gods just decided they didn't like you, or you would get rewarded just because the gods decided they liked you for no particular reason, one way or the other. Yes, go ahead.
Gets a lot of blame today in intellectual circles.
When you say Zionism, what do you mean by Zionism?
Well, it's a way of blaming Jews and Christians.
Yes.
When you lump Zionists together as being responsible for terrorism, because somehow they are justified in retaliating for Zionist imperialists taking their land.
Yes.
And CIA toppling their people and putting their own people in there. Liberal intellectuals have been beating up on Zionists for decades, and now the media has co-opted this byline. So it's very popular to subtly blame Jews, but more so blame Christians.
Christians, Jews, anybody but the current popular group. Interestingly enough, my start page on the internet is Google News. And down at the bottom of Google News, they have a section called Religion. They'll have, international news, business news, sports news, entertainment news, and then at the very bottom, because it's not important, is religious news. And I'm always looking for something interesting down there. And invariably, the only thing I ever see down there is negative articles about people of religion. That's all I ever see. It's always a negative article about Christians and anyone who believes in God. So apparently it's not about religion, it's about atheism. But anyway, let us move forward. So it says in verse 10, after the end of 20 years, this is half of his reign. He's probably in his early 40s by now, maybe 50s by now, during which Solomon built these two buildings, the temple and the royal palace. He gave 20 towns in Galilee to Hiram, king of Tyre. They were good buddies. Hiram provided him with a lot of resources and continued to do so through his entire reign. And it said here, because Hiram had supplied him with all the cedar and juniper and the gold he wanted. But Hiram was not really pleased with these towns. We went down from Tyre to look at the towns that Solomon had given him, and it says they were not pleasing to him. And Hiram says, "What kind of towns are these you've given me, my brother?" And he called them the land of Kabul, which sounds very much like good for nothing in Hebrew. So they were the land of Kabul, the good for nothing land. And but apparently Hiram continued to be his friend, because it does not say that they ever had war together or anything. And it says, and that name they have until this day. By the way, the person who is writing this is apparently writing some years later, but not more than a couple of generations, perhaps a few generations later, because this person makes references on several occasions to Israel and Judah under the divided kingdom, when he's making geographical references. That had not yet happened when at this point. The divided kingdom comes somewhat later. But the person who is writing this stuff and says, okay, this is still true today, you see that, we know this because you can walk down the street and look at it, was writing somewhat later under the divided kingdom. And so he says, I guess it's a he, could be a she, on several occasions that they, it says this is a name they have to this day in verse 13. It says, now Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold, which if the scholars are correct, that's 4.5 tons of gold. And so we'll move on. Now, remember when he was building the temple and the royal palace and everything, he talked about using forced labor. And they didn't explain what that was. So the next several verses here, it says, here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple in his own palace, and the terraces and the wall of Jerusalem and all this other stuff. Basically what happened was there were people that had not been eradicated, that they had conquered. And it says in verse 20, there were still people left from the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They were not Israelites. Solomon had conscripted the descendants of these people who were still in the land, that it says, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as slave labor, as it is to this day. Again, this is still the case when this person is writing. But it said Solomon did not make slaves of any of the Israelites. They were his fighting men, his government officials, his officers, captains, and commanders of his chariots and charioteers, and his chief officials. And the person lists that there are 550 of those such people. So, Solomon goes down to the temple. He just makes a casual reference in verse 25. It says, Solomon went down 3 times to the temple to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on the altar he had built. This was standard practice 3 times a year to go down there and do that. Yes? Yes, tell me about it.
From Megiddo, you can look across the plains of Australia and you can see for about 30 miles. So anybody that was approaching them from the north, they would have had time to ride from Megiddo back to Jerusalem and warn the people and get the armies ready before they got there.
Is this a hillside or a plain or what?
Megiddo is a hill.
Okay, but is it a large flat hill or something?
Yeah, it's the ruins of the city are still there.
Okay.
And also the ruins of one of the great wells that they had there
Okay.
are still there.
This has additional meaning also, doesn't it, as in Armageddon?
Well, it is said that the plains of Australia are fertile because of the blood of all the armies that have fought there over the years.
And we've all heard of Armageddon, of course.
And all that, Armageddon simply means the hill of Megiddo.
The hill of Megiddo, yeah. Okay. But it has come into the language, of course, to mean something totally different. Okay, so Solomon, it says in verse 26, builds a bunch of ships, and he and Hiram continue to have their relationship. They have these large navies and everything, and they go out and they do trade and conquering and things like that. Chapter 10 is the famous story of the Queen of Sheba, and it's kind of interesting. We don't really know where Sheba was. Some people thought it was somewhere in Egypt. Some people thought it was in Yemen, in the Arab countries. The Ethiopians have, for at least 2,000 years, claimed that she was the Queen of Ethiopia. And she hears about Solomon, goes, and if you've seen the old movies with, I cannot think of the guy's name. Who's the bald-headed guy that played Solomon years and years and years ago? Yul Brynner, I can never remember his name. But you remember the Queen of Sheba, who was probably who? Gina Lollobrigida, maybe? Comes and visits him, and that story is elaborated, of course, using some of the legends that we'll mention here in a minute. So she comes with a huge caravan with lots of gifts for him, and she is shocked and amazed and blown away by all of his riches and his the amount of food that's on his table on a daily basis. And she asks him all kinds of questions, and he impresses her with his great wisdom and intelligence, and she's just blown away. She gives him large quantities in verse 10 of gold and spices and precious stones. Supposedly the largest gift anyone ever gave anybody. Typical Jewish overstatement, but of the time, but probably quite a large amount of stuff. And then down in verse 13, Solomon gives her whatever she asks for out of his royal bounty. And so she returns with her entourage to her own country. And that's all it says about the Queen of Sheba. She comes in, she brings him a bunch of gifts, he entertains her for some period of time. It's unclear how long that is, but it sounds as though it might have been for an extended period. And then she goes back to her own country. The legend that has arisen out of this is that they had a son named Menelik. And Solomon does not know about this son. And when she gets back to Sheba, which is presumably Ethiopia, Menelik is born, and when he is a grown man, I think in his early 20s, he goes back, which would have to have been really close to the time of Solomon's death, since he only reigned for 40 years. He goes back and visits his father, and steals the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the likelihood of that is just about zero. Just about zero. Yes, comment.
If you don't want to invest in an expensive cable package to get the History Channel, you can just get YouTube that has gotten new funding, and there are documentaries, full documentaries now, that have attempted to substantiate.
Yeah, and it's all based on legend.
Well,
all of it is.
Supposedly they did genetic testing
Yeah. How do you do genetic testing on a body you don't have?
On the Ethiopian people.
Well, there are a lot of Jewish blood in Ethiopian people. There was a big Jewish population in that area.
And supposedly the ark was rescued.
I see. Well, I was going to mention that. Presumably, he somehow gets the ark, takes it back to Ethiopia, and according to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church head, who has never seen it, by the way, the ark is residing in the town of Aksum, A-K-S-U-M, in northern Ethiopia, in the Church of St. Mary of Zion. And if you've seen any of the documentaries on TV, you can actually see the little church building, and there is a priest, I guess is the correct term, one priest who is assigned to guard it. That would be very boring work, I would think, to oversee it. And just before he dies, I don't know how he knows he's going to die, but just before he dies, he names his successor, and that person goes in and continues to look after the ark. Every year, they take a copy that they have built of the ark and parade it through the streets of this city in celebration of the fact that they have the Ark of the Covenant, which nobody can see except the one priest. So, for whatever that's worth, that's the other story behind the King Solomon and Queen of Sheba visit. So, in verse 14, it starts talking about all of the money and everything that he's got, and all of the shields made out of gold, and the swords, and the chariots, and they're just impressing the life out of you with all the stuff he has. He builds this huge throne that has like 6 steps going up to it and 12 lions on it. Why lions? Why would you put lions? To us. What was David called and Christ called? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so this had already come to be a big deal to them. The lion represented the kings of Judah. And many of the other countries around might have used lions, but more often than not, they would use these mythical-looking beasts, these griffins and things with eagle heads and wings and lions and bodies. You've seen that in the Babylonian and the earlier things if you took much history in either high school or college. And they were all mythical, apparently. Anyway, he builds this fantastic throne, and it says in verse 21, all of his goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace were gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. So in other words, even silver was just so common, they would just use it for simple stuff, everyday things. I'm reminded of how we treat salt in our society. Salt is dirt cheap, isn't it? What does a pound of salt, a pound box of salt cost? 79, 89 cents, depending on which brand you get. By the way, it's all just salt. It makes no difference. It's pure sodium chloride, and maybe with a little iodine added to it. It's what? 79, 89 cents a pound. Used to, salt was so valuable that the Roman soldiers actually got paid in salt. You've heard the term, he's worth his salt? That's where that term comes from. Salt used to be extremely valuable. Now it's very cheap to us. That's right, not worth the salt that you put in your bread. So salt used to be very expensive. Now it's very cheap. To Solomon, silver was very cheap. It was not an expensive item to him. He had so much of it, it was just used for everyday, routine stuff. They made chamber pots out of it, things like that. On the other hand, pepper is rather expensive in our culture. You go out and you buy a box of pepper about that high for $4, So pepper is kind of expensive. I did not know it, but steel was extremely expensive in the late 1800s. When they first started making steel, it was so expensive, the only thing they could afford to make out of it was cutlery. Like we do sterling silver cutlery, they would make cutlery out of steel because steel was so expensive. Now steel is everywhere and is very cheap. So the value and the cost of things can change dramatically based on supply and demand and production costs, I guess. So anyway, silver was cheap in Solomon's court. And it continues to talk about how the gold flowed in and out of his country and all the money and all the things like that. Down in chapter 11, Solomon, the person is extolling all the wonders of Solomon and all of his riches and everything and has told all the great things about Solomon, and then he shifts gears. He says, King Solomon, however, so here comes the downside. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Remember, he was married to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh had done a lot of things with him. In fact, he had an alliance with Pharaoh down in Egypt. But it says he loved lots of foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites. They were from nations about which Jehovah had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them. And here's why. Because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. I don't know who should be more insulted there, men or women. Apparently, ladies, you have a lot of power over us. I did not know that. Actually, I did. You have more power than you realize. It says, they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Now, that's a negative. Let's turn that to the positive side. Ladies, you have a huge influence on the church that you may not have known you had. You have the ability, indeed, the responsibility of holding the church together. I've often referred to women as the glue that holds the church together. And men, we don't like that particularly because we think we're in charge, and we are officially in charge. But without the women, there would be no church. I'm sorry. Yes, dear, it does. And especially the women. Exactly. If you go back and look at the people that were following Jesus and that were helping Jesus and really, really participating in his ministry, they talk a lot about the men, but there were a lot of women in there. A lot of women. And early on, more women came to Christ than men. And I'm thinking that may still be the case. That may still be the case. Ladies, you have great responsibilities and great power. We would rather you didn't, but you do. You can influence us greatly. Use that power wisely for the glory of the Lord, please, because you do have great power. And this is what God was warning Solomon about. Solomon was king of one of the greatest nations at the kingdoms of the time. And God says, you go after all these women and they will make you go after false gods. And I'm sure I can see Solomon going, no, that's not going to happen to me. I'm never going to do that. Well, now, honey, I just want you to go down here and do something. Well, anything you want, sugar booger. Just whatever you want. You know, that's how it is, isn't it? Okay. So, it says, Solomon nevertheless held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Holy cow. And his wives led him astray. They could have probably physically picked him up and led him astray with that many. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to Jehovah his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Remember, David was a terrible person at times, but his heart was always toward God. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow Jehovah completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Now, it doesn't say he actually participated in that, but he approved of it, apparently, because he set all this stuff up. Now, you've probably heard of some of these gods. Ashtaroth, also known as Ashtar, and several other names, was a female deity of fairly ancient origin. She goes all the way back to the Assyrians, and probably came all the way forward into the Greeks and the Romans as Venus and Aphrodite and Hera and things like that. But she was basically a fertility goddess, goddess of the earth, maybe a moon goddess, maybe the Venus goddess. They're not really sure, but some of the things associated with her were ritual. I can't say it. Ritual sex with priestesses and things like that. So he set up a place for that. And then the other one, Molech, spelled different ways, M-O-L-O-C-H, M-O-L-E-K, and about 8 other ways, was a really nasty idol-type god. By the way, his name appears to mean king. In ancient Semitic languages. He was an Ammonite god. And what was really bad about Molech, in fact, they were told, I believe over in Deuteronomy, not to make their children pass through the fires of Molech. Basically, you sacrificed your children to Molech. And people go, oh, that's horrible. Yes, it is horrible. It's unbelievably horrible. But these people were so devoted to this god that they actually would sacrifice their children to this god. Now, these people didn't go home happy. They went home very sad. So we need to look at that at a slightly different view. It's still horrible, but they did not enjoy the idea any more than Abraham enjoyed the idea of sacrificing Isaac. Remember that story? And God stopped him before he did it. He was testing Abraham to see if he was willing to do it. If it came down to it, could you do it? If it came down to where you had to decide to reject God or give up your children in some fashion, could you do it? I don't know. I hope I'm never tested in that way.
There would be some in society that would do that. Because look at the diversity of people today and what stupid things that they do.
I mean, some people will stupidly do it, out of devotion maybe.
Their devotion to that particular God.
Yeah.
They thought they got from it.
But if it actually came down to it, let's say, for example, somebody's holding a gun to your child's head and says, you can deny Christ and your child will live, or you can affirm your belief in Christ and your child will die. That would be hard, wouldn't it? I do not choose to say which way I would go on that, because I don't know that I would know until that instant. Yes, dear?
I can appreciate that, and I think sometimes we think, we can think like that, extreme. But I think when I think about Satan, he's so much more subtle.
Oh yeah.
And I think
everybody hear that? He's so much more subtle than that.
Yeah, and so we get caught up into things that seemingly don't even mean anything. And we do sacrifice our children. We do sacrifice unknowingly, blindly, because we really don't understand.
Or stupidly.
Whichever way. Because we don't really understand who our adversary is.
I think you've got to the core of it, haven't you?
Well, I would like to think I'm learning that.
Yeah.
Because
We do it.
we do it
Absent-mindedly.
And we have technology, we have media, we have our jobs, just everything about our whole life has been. It's like, oh, this is wonderful. I'm an American, and this would never happen here.
So we
really get sucked in. Really poured into all of the devices that we would say we would never be in because we become desensitized to what really is the Word of God. And it's like He is very straight. He is very to the point. And I had a conversation with someone, I had a conversation with someone yesterday, and they were telling me about one of their struggles, about decisions that they needed to make. But then they also shared with me one of the challenges they were having. And they have this grand opportunity presented to them, and that opportunity can adversely affect the challenge that they have, that they shared with me. And so when we were praying, it's like they realized, oh, I need this opportunity for what I need. But yet I have this challenge, and I'm charged to do this challenge, but then they got this scenario going on. And so it's like, it's a gift, but it's a curse. And so they really have to make a wise decision based on what they need and what they perceive to be as a gift, or is it a test that they really need to put their attention where they really know it's supposed to be.
Or temptation.
Yeah, and so Joshua said, I think about what Joshua said, for me and my house, if there was no hesitation in his voice, he said, for me and my house, this is how we roll up in here.
We're going to serve the Lord. You go out and serve wherever you want to. We're going to have this.
But this is what we do here. And there was no hesitation. And I think we hesitate. And we cannot be people who hesitate. Because we are faced with spiritual wickedness in high places that it just sort of comes along and it feels good, it looks good, and there's nothing wrong with it. Because it really isn't. Until you get into it and you swim in it. So,
that's great. That's great. I can't add a thing to that. I'm sorry. That's really, really good. I'm glad you finished up for me. You brought the lesson home there for me. I appreciate it so much. Well, it is now 10:15 according to that clock, which means it's almost 10:16 on the real clock. May the Lord be with you. May He always keep you close to His heart, and may you always seek to do His will through Christ our Lord. Amen.